It was a chilly Wednesday morning in Washington, D.C., when Karoline Leavitt, the fiery and unyielding White House press secretary under President Donald Trump, stepped into the courtroom of Judge Malcolm Brewster, a name that had become synonymous with political favoritism and behind-the-scenes deals. The hearing was supposed to be a routine matter involving a legal challenge to the president's latest executive order aimed at strengthening domestic manufacturing. But Karoline, known for her poise and unshakable loyalty to the administration, had been personally summoned to testify. What was meant to be a standard proceeding quickly unraveled into something far darker as cameras rolled outside and murmurs filled the courtroom. It became clear that Judge Brewster had no intentions of maintaining judicial neutrality. From the moment Karoline took the stand, the judge's tone shifted. His questions were laced with sarcasm, his gavel slammed more aggressively than necessary, and his eyes narrowed with disdain every time she responded with facts. "So, Ms. Leavitt," Brewster began, leaning forward with an exaggerated smirk, "are you here to defend another one of your boss's publicity stunts? Or do you actually understand the Constitution?" Gasps echoed across the courtroom. Karoline didn't flinch. "I'm here to uphold the law and defend what this administration believes is in the best interest of the American people," she replied calmly. "Oh, really?" the judge barked. "Do you even know what that means? Or are you just reading off another White House cue card?" The gallery stirred uncomfortably. Even the stenographer paused for a moment. This wasn't cross-examination, it was character assassination. Despite the insult, Karoline didn't waver. Her experience with the media, protesters, and political opponents had prepared her for moments like these. But what she didn't know was that Judge Brewster's actions today would finally unearth a chain of events he'd been running from for years, and that this courtroom, the very one he thought he ruled like a king, would soon become the stage of his downfall. Outside the courthouse, a team of federal investigators sat in unmarked vehicles. A quiet investigation into Brewster had been simmering for months. Kickbacks from liberal lobbying groups, undisclosed offshore accounts, and sealed records hiding conflict of interest cases. But today, everything would change. The moment Karoline walked in, it wasn't just the trial that began. It was Brewster's unraveling. The tension grew as Karoline presented data defending the Trump administration's decision to reallocate federal funds toward job-producing industries. The judge scoffed and interrupted frequently, refusing to allow her full answers. Cameras from several news outlets outside began to pick up the whispers spreading from courtroom insiders. "He's out of line. He's trying to humiliate her. This isn't a hearing. It's a witch hunt." Karoline's team, seated behind her, exchanged glances. They knew she could handle the pressure, but something was off. This wasn't a rogue judge having a bad day. This was something more personal. And it would soon be proven why. Judge Brewster slammed his gavel once more. "I will not allow this circus to continue," he snapped. "We're done here." But just as he reached for his robe to adjourn the session, the courtroom doors opened, and several stern-faced agents from the Department of Justice stepped inside. Gasps echoed through the courtroom as 6 agents, clad in dark suits with visible DOJ credentials, strode through the aisle with a purposeful stride. The lead agent, a tall woman with steel-gray hair and an icy stare, stepped directly in front of Judge Brewster's bench. "Judge Malcolm Brewster," she said, her voice clear and steady. "You are under federal investigation. Effective immediately, this courtroom is now under jurisdictional review." The room froze. Brewster stood, eyes wide, trying to maintain authority. "This is my courtroom," he barked. "You have no right to barge in here like this." "Bailiff!" The bailiff didn't move. He stood stiffly, eyes on the agents, clearly aware of what was going down. The lead DOJ agent held out a thick envelope wrapped in a red band, a warrant. "This is a federal warrant for your arrest, signed and approved by the Attorney General," she said, placing it on the bench. "We have evidence of bribery, conspiracy, obstruction of justice, and unlawful political targeting." Karoline remained seated, her composure as elegant as ever. She turned to glance at her legal counsel, who leaned over and whispered, "It's happening." The investigation finally caught up to him. Outside, the press had no idea yet. Reporters huddled near the front steps were still discussing Judge Brewster's verbal attacks on Karoline. No one had predicted this twist. But inside, history was being made. Judge Brewster's face turned pale. This is absurd. Political retribution. That's what this is. You think Trump's DOJ can? But before he could finish, the agent motioned to her team. Two stepped behind the bench. One pulled out handcuffs. You can either cooperate or we do this the hard way, she said. You've been under surveillance for over 8 months. We have video recordings, financial documents, and testimony from 3 whistleblowers. The game is over. In one final, desperate act, Brewster turned toward Karoline. This is because of you, he sneered. You and your cult leader president. You've corrupted the entire justice system. Karoline slowly stood, her voice cool and even. No, Your Honor, she replied. This is justice finally catching up to corruption. And it has nothing to do with me. It has everything to do with the truth. The room erupted into a low murmur. Even members of the press who had managed to sneak into the back rows looked stunned. They'd come to witness a routine court appearance. Instead, they were watching a federal judge be arrested mid-session. The cuffs snapped around Brewster's wrists with a metallic finality. You'll regret this, he muttered as he was led away. I have powerful friends. But he didn't. Not anymore. The very people who once protected him in the shadows were already distancing themselves. Erasing emails, deleting contacts, rewriting narratives. Brewster was no longer useful. He was a liability. As the agents exited with the disgraced judge in tow, Karoline turned to the crowd, then walked gracefully back to her table. Her legal team stood and applauded quietly, one by one. Even opposing counsel, though bitter and clearly shocked, offered a respectful nod. Outside the courthouse, the news broke within minutes. Breaking news. Federal judge arrested in middle of hearing involving White House Press Secretary Karoline Leavitt. Social media exploded. Supporters of the Trump administration hailed it as a victory for accountability. Even moderate voices in the media struggled to deny the gravity of what had just occurred. But behind the scenes, something even bigger was beginning to unfold. Brewster's arrest was only the tip of the iceberg. Later that evening, Karoline Leavitt sat down in her White House office, still in her navy blue courtroom dress, sipping a lukewarm cup of chamomile tea. The images of Judge Brewster being escorted out in cuffs were now plastered across every major news outlet. But she wasn't basking in the media frenzy. Not yet. She was more focused on the briefcase sitting on her desk. Inside it were documents, explosive ones. The kind that could unravel a network of corruption so vast, it would leave the media breathless and the American public stunned. Brewster's crimes went far beyond accepting bribes and intimidating conservative witnesses. He had been one of the gatekeepers in a quiet alliance of bureaucrats, political operatives, and rogue donors determined to sabotage any progress made by the Trump administration. She flipped through a set of files labeled Project Nightshade. DOJ agents had uncovered it during the raid on Brewster's private chambers. The files contained a long list of political targets, including military contractors who had donated to America First campaigns, religious leaders voicing support for Trump's border policies, and even Karoline's own staff members, all monitored, some harassed, others quietly prosecuted. And there was more: financial statements traced to offshore accounts in the Cayman Islands, secret meetings with operatives from foreign-funded think tanks, and encrypted emails with liberal power brokers in D.C., all conspiring to use the court system as a political weapon. Karoline leaned back in her chair, eyes locked on the final page of the report. Brewster wasn't acting alone. 2 other federal judges, both appointed during previous administrations, were named as assets. One had presided over several suspicious rulings related to immigration. The other, a key player in suppressing whistleblower lawsuits connected to COVID-19 relief fund abuse. A quiet knock interrupted her thoughts. It was her aide, Logan. Ma'am, I just got off the phone with AG Bondi. She says the president wants you in the Oval in 15 minutes. He wants a full debrief, personally. Karoline nodded. Tell him I'm on my way. As Logan left, she picked up the briefcase, adjusted her posture, and made her way toward the West Wing. Secret Service agents opened the heavy doors of the Oval Office as she arrived, revealing President Donald J. Trump standing behind the resolute desk, arms crossed, eyes fiery with focus. "Karoline," he said, gesturing toward the chair across from him. "You were incredible today. You didn't just win a hearing, you exposed a criminal empire. Sit. Talk to me." She laid the briefcase on the desk and opened it slowly. "Mr. President, what happened today was only the beginning. Brewster's network is bigger than we thought. He was coordinating with people inside multiple federal departments." Trump raised his eyebrows and leaned forward. "Is it deep state?" "Worse," she said. "It's state-sponsored sabotage. Foreign interests. Judicial activism funded by billionaires who want America weak. And they were using Brewster to choke out every economic reform we've passed." Trump took a deep breath and let out a long sigh. "This changes everything." Karoline continued, "Brewster will talk. The DOJ is offering him a deal, reduced sentence in exchange for full cooperation. If he flips, we'll have names, evidence, maybe even enough to rewrite how the American justice system has been quietly manipulated for years." There was a heavy silence, then Trump stood and extended his hand to her. "Karoline, you just made history. And you may have just saved this country from a much darker future." She shook his hand firmly. "Thank you, Mr. President. But there's still work to do." As she left the Oval Office that night, a sense of duty weighed on her shoulders, but so did a sense of purpose. The arrest of Judge Brewster wasn't just a victory for the Trump administration, it was the first crack in a fortress of deceit that had hidden behind black robes and sealed courtrooms for far too long. By the next morning, Washington, D.C. had turned into a pressure cooker of whispers, emergency meetings, and frantic phone calls. Several powerful names, judges, attorneys, political strategists, and think tank heads were scrambling to assess the fallout from Judge Brewster's arrest. A confidential video of his initial DOJ interrogation had already leaked. In it, Brewster, eyes sunken and voice shaky, detailed how he'd received offshore payments disguised as speaking fees. But more shockingly, he named names. Federal Judge Alan Drexler, former Intelligence Committee staffer Rachel Monet, and even a one-time advisor to a 2020 Democratic presidential candidate. The media had no choice but to cover the storm, though many outlets danced carefully around the narrative. MSNBC labeled it a political witch hunt with suspicious timing. CNN focused on Brewster's denial of intent to abuse authority. But Fox News, Newsmax, and the Daily Wire? They ran wall-to-wall coverage, hailing it as the trial that turned the tide. Meanwhile, Karoline Leavitt remained stoic and focused. She returned to the press briefing room that afternoon, standing behind the podium with the presidential seal, wearing a crisp white blazer and steely expression. "I will not stand before you today and gloat," she began, silencing the chaotic flurry of shouted questions from reporters. "Because this is not about me. It's about restoring trust in the American justice system, something this administration is fully committed to." A reporter from Politico shouted out, "Karoline, how do you respond to claims that this is revenge politics?" Karoline nodded calmly. "There's no revenge in justice. There's only accountability. If holding corrupt officials accountable for abusing their power feels like revenge to someone, perhaps they were too close to the corruption themselves." A buzz swept the room. Cameras clicked in a frenzy, but outside of the camera's lens, something more sinister was taking root. In a nondescript building tucked away in a Virginia suburb, 3 suited individuals sat in a private room with an emergency agenda. One of them was a former Department of State official. Another, a tech mogul known for dark money donations. The third? A current circuit court judge, unnamed in public but feared in private. "The Brewster situation is a disaster," the judge muttered, pouring bourbon into a glass. "If he flips completely, he won't stop at Drexler. He'll name half the judiciary." The tech mogul rubbed his temples. The Leavitt girl, she was supposed to be a token. A press secretary with a pretty face. Now she's a wrecking ball. They discussed options. Damage control. Media manipulation. Even legal obstruction. But the walls were closing in faster than they anticipated. What none of them knew was that their entire meeting was being recorded. A hidden microphone had been placed under the conference table by a double agent working with the DOJ. The net was tightening. Back in the White House, President Trump, Vice President J.D. Vance, and Attorney General Pam Bondi met for an emergency session. A map of the federal judiciary was spread across the table with red markers on compromised judges and agencies. "This isn't just one corrupt judge," Pam said. "This is a coordinated effort. A judicial coup in slow motion." "And now," Trump said, tapping the table, "we strike back with transparency." Karoline entered the room holding a stack of affidavits, signed whistleblower testimonies, and financial evidence gathered by agents just the night before. "The American people need to know," she said firmly. Not in 10 years, not in a memoir. Now. Trump looked at her, proud and resolute. Then we go public. Prime time. Let the world watch. A nationally televised address was scheduled. Networks scrambled. This wasn't campaign politics anymore, it was a national reckoning, but as the day came to a close, one thing became clear: the fight for justice had only just begun. The nation sat glued to their screens that Friday evening as President Donald Trump addressed the country from the White House with Karoline Leavitt by his side. The American flag stood tall behind them, and in his signature tone, Trump didn't mince words. For far too long, he said, a shadow network within our very own justice system has operated above the law, unchecked and unchallenged. But that ends tonight. The arrest of Judge Brewster is not just a scandal, it's a wake-up call. And under this administration, justice will never be bought. He stepped aside and gave the podium to Karoline. She stood firm, calm, yet electrifying. When I walked into that courtroom, I didn't know I would walk out having helped expose a judicial cartel. But what I did know, she said, voice cracking with emotion, was that I represented millions of Americans who believe in fairness, truth, and a system that serves the people, not elite agendas. She then began listing name after name, case after case, injustice after injustice. Viewers across America were stunned. Social media lit up like a wildfire. Hashtags like #JusticeReborn and #DrainTheCourts trended globally. Even skeptics found themselves rewatching the clip of Brewster being arrested, now juxtaposed with damning financial ledgers and secret recordings. As the nation processed the truth, federal marshals executed coordinated raids on the homes and offices of multiple officials named in Brewster's testimony. Overnight, arrests were made in New York, Chicago, Los Angeles, and even within the D.C. Circuit. Former Judge Alan Drexler was found attempting to destroy documents in a hotel shredder. Rachel Monet, the ex-intelligence staffer, was caught boarding a private jet bound for Zurich. All of them were charged under the Public Integrity Restoration Act, a revived piece of Trump-era legislation originally buried by previous administrations. In a rare move, Chief Justice Lawrence Kellen of the U.S. Supreme Court issued a public statement the next morning: the American judiciary is not above scrutiny. Those who wear the robe must do so with honor. We commend the White House for its courage in restoring faith in our courts. Meanwhile, Karoline Leavitt's name became more than just a footnote in White House history. She became a symbol. Schools began studying her courtroom testimony. Political analysts debated whether she'd run for Senate or governor someday. Parents told their daughters, "You want to change the world? Be like her." But Karoline didn't seek the limelight. The next week, she was seen quietly exiting a shelter for women who had been wrongfully imprisoned, many by Brewster's court. She didn't tell the press. She just showed up, listened, hugged, and promised them that what happened would never be allowed again. One of those women, eyes brimming with tears, said to her, "You didn't just lock up a judge. You unlocked hope." Back at the White House, Trump handed her a letter. A handwritten note from former President Ronald Reagan's library curator. It simply read, "If the Constitution had a voice, it would have sounded like yours in that courtroom." Karoline smiled softly, folded the letter, and tucked it into her bag. Then she turned back to her desk, where more files waited. Because for her, the mission was never about fame. It was about country, about truth, and about the oath she carried every time she stood before the American people.